Mark Katchen, who is a managing principal of the Phylmar Group, and this is an international environmental health and safety and sustainability consulting firm. Mark he's a certified industrial hygienist with 35 years in the business, and he has experience dealing with international environmental supply chain issues. Today, the topic is international ethics in supply chain. So, Mark, is there any more you want to provide about a background of yourself?
No, I think that's about it. We certainly have a broad base in some of these, broadly from international. We do work in Asia and Europe, South America, so we've got quite a broad base of experience.
Great. Well, my first question is, what is a typical scenario that you deal with regarding international environmental supply chain issues?
Well, let's done from the ethical standpoint. Let's take an example of a company that's operating and producing, say, widgets in the U.S., United Kingdom, and Germany. And as part of that production process, they have to use, say, a fairly toxic chemical called methylene chloride. In each of those countries, there's different limits of exposure that are allowed for a given employee population. So the question is, which limit or limits should the company adhere to in those varying facilities? It's a typical scenario.
Are there any frameworks that you can use to resolve these issues?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we try to use what's known as an 8-step kind of framework to deal with these with some of these ethical conundrums, and they're really rooted in a couple of basic principles. One is what we call now non-malfeasance, which is avoiding any kind of harmful acts. Second is beneficence, which really is maximizing potential benefits. Third is respect for individuals and communities. And the fourth is one of justice, treating equals equally, so to speak. So with respect to the framework, the first step is really gathering facts. In other words, what are those, in this case, what are those particular exposure limits in each of the locations? For example, here in the United States, the exposure limit is what we call 25 parts per million of exposure. In the UK, it's 100, and in Germany, it's 50. So we know that. Then the next step is then we review the standards for ethical practice that a professional who's acting in that way, and in my case, being a certified industrial hygienist, I'm looking at what's called the American Board of Industrial Hygiene has a ethical practice, and so I'm going to use that as a basis in terms of code of ethics that I'm going to apply. And the third step is really to articulate those ethical concerns. For example, if the company merely complies with the local law, it may be treating employees differently with respect to disease risks in these different localities. So that presents the dilemma that we're having to deal with. The fourth step is really determining the ethics principles involved. In other words, we're looking at issues of compliance as a baseline, but what about how does that gel with the code of ethics that a professional would have, like myself, in trying to apply these standards as well as the code, and how do we mesh them together? In the fifth step, we determine whether the principles are in tension with each other, and to see, for example, the dilemma provides some nuances to consider. For example, complying with the law is an ethical act, so therefore, if we request in the UK factory to reduce its exposure limits by a factor of 4, maybe increase costs for them. If the local law is satisfied, should the cost be considered as part of the cost-benefit equation? Maybe yes and maybe no, because while we take that into consideration, how does that play into the fact that we're still exposing a population at greater risk if we only look at those cost perspectives? So we're always looking at not only a cost-benefit analysis, but from an ethical standpoint, how do we work all that into this framework? The sixth step is determining options, including analysis of the pros and cons. So we just talked about that from a cost standpoint. What are the good parts and the bad parts? So that while we may be, it may cost us a little more to bring those exposure levels down to a common exposure level, it may be beneficial in the long run, because if we have information that suggests that people would be at considerably greater risk to be exposed at the, say, the UK level of 100 parts per million, we may be saving us in the long run in terms of that employee's productivity, because if they get sick, or something like especially if it's something like cancer, we would lose that individual, and therefore that would have a much broader impact than maybe the cost of actually controlling the exposure. The seventh step is soliciting feedback, and that's including from local shareholders, so stakeholders, excuse me. So we want to get input from, say, the UK and Germany folks to indicate how that's going to work. Is that lowest limit of 25 parts per million, for example, attainable? And what would that take, and over what period of time can we do it? It may take a few years and work out certain budgeting requirements to make sure it works. And finally, the eighth step is to finally decide on approach. What approach are we finally going to take? How are we going to implement this? What makes the most sense in terms of our operations on this global scale? So those are Dustin, the 8 steps that we would use in this process.
And how do you apply these frameworks in practice?
So at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is look at what makes the most sense in terms of achieving the really as low as reasonably achievable perspective in all the scenarios. We want to make sure, because we always find out new information as things evolve, and normally these limits never go up or increase, they always tend to go down. And as a result, again, we may reach a certain level today, but if we get more information tomorrow, that it really makes sense to try to get as low as we possibly can. And so even though that we might hit a certain or try to establish a certain benchmark today, if we can get lower using the same technology or modification, even slightly more, then it makes sense to do it. So we're always trying to get the lowest reasonable, achievable limit that we can.
And thank you, Mark, for sharing today.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dustin. Appreciate the opportunity.